Field by field, Mazex is bringing Canadian seed to farmers across Canada. Mazex is your source for high-performance soybeans and grain, silage, and grazing corn hybrids. Visit mazex.com to find your local Mazex representative.
Bernard Tobin here at Ag in Motion in Saskatoon. I am over at Nutrien Premium Fertilizer Technologies now, catching up with senior agronomist Lyle Cowell. Lyle, how's it going?
It's going great, thank you.
Hey, I want to talk about forages, and
yes,
and how do we best maintain soil fertility and push our production? And maybe that conversation starts with the 4 R's.
It does start with the 4 R's. 4 R's. Using fertilizer at the right rate, using the right product, applying it at the right time and in the right place. The problem with forages is rate. It's by far most important. The reason for that is that we tend to not fertilize forages at all or very little. So moving the bar with forages is pretty simple because most forages see zero fertilizer. We just want to find a right rate that will maximize production, and that's the first step in the 4 R's for forages.
Hey, let's talk about, I guess, fertility and nutrient requirements for forage. What are forages looking for, and what are they missing?
Well, for grasses in particular, it's always going to be nitrogen. Well, not always, but almost always will be a nitrogen deficiency. So that's where you'll always think about starting, especially with a grass stand, or even in a blended stand with, say, brome grass and alfalfa. That brome grass is usually suffering from a lack of nitrogen. So that's the place to start, and the place to start then is to try find the right rate for that stand of nitrogen. Now, we don't want to just exclude the other nutrients. There's certainly going to be other nutrients that it may be required in a lot of forage stands. And we shouldn't also forget that we have forage legumes. So alfalfa, if we inoculate alfalfa properly, it'll fix its own nitrogen. But when it comes to forages, and in particular with grass forages, we need to start with nitrogen rates.
Yeah. Hey, let's talk about another starting point, and that's when producers are sort of managing their ground. I guess, what do we need to be looking at? Certainly starting with soil type.
Well, so how are we going to figure out what is the right rate of nitrogen for a forage stand? That's not easy to do. There's a number of reasons that it's hard to do. And one of those is that forages are they're always growing, these perennial forages, and they're always absorbing moisture as well as nutrients. And so when you take a soil test from a forage stand, it almost always measures low levels of nutrients in a soil test. So it can be hard to use a soil test alone to understand requirements. Then there's other tools that you can think about, just understanding the soil type that you have. Is it more likely to be deficient in a given nutrient? And you can think about that. But then the simplest way is the try-it solution. It's the strip trials. You've never applied nitrogen to your bromegrass stand? Apply some strips across your field. Maybe you apply it at 40 and 80 and 120 pounds of N and some strips, and see what is going to be the right rate for your crop. Yeah. And you can take it from there. Other nutrients might be deficient. You might think that, for example, your alfalfa stand is not doing well. It's been cut for hay for 4 or 5 years and it's declining. Maybe it's phosphorus deficient. Maybe it's potassium deficient. Maybe it's sulfur deficient. The best way to know, again, is just that simple try-it solution, putting some strips across the field.
Okay, let's go back to the 4 R's for a second. Obviously, that right rate is so important.
Right rate is critical.
One of the things you also want to talk about was that right placement.
Yeah, we do have to always remember, once we get down the road on right rate, there's 3 other R's. Right product, right placement, right time. Well, and that depends on which nutrient. We always want to mitigate the risk of loss of a nutrient while also maximizing yields. So say we have a bromegrass stand and we've decided that we want to apply nitrogen to that bromegrass stand. The best time to do it is just before a good rainfall. That's not always easy to do, but if you can, remembering that we are going to have to broadcast that nitrogen fertilizer, if we can apply it just before a good rainfall, it'll help move the urea into the soil and avoid any significant losses as ammonia gas. So that's an important step. Now, the biggest problem that farmers often face is they're waiting for that rain and waiting, and maybe there was lots of good snow melt and the crop is growing well, and you may have missed some yield potential by waiting too long. There's not much we can do about that. We have to find a way of getting it into the soil, and rainfall is always not going to be on your side. Other nutrients are a little easier to manage. You can broadcast phosphorus, potassium, sulfur at almost any point. And on a forage stand, because there's very little runoff from a forage stand, it'll stay in place. It'll generally stay in place. And so really the right rate, or sorry, the right time to apply phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur is well, it's yesterday, if it's required.
Hey, final question for you, and that is, fertility needs, especially when it comes to, managing a second crop. We focused on the first crop, but there's certainly great opportunities for a second crop. What do we need to think about from a fertility perspective?
Yeah, so it depends on which crop again, but let's say it was a bromegrass stand, and you take your first cut, you applied some nitrogen fertilizer, had a pretty good hay cut, but you've had some good mid-summer rains, and you have an opportunity to take a second cut of hay. But the problem is that these are forage stands that are perennial, and they're growing all year round, and they're utilizing nitrogen all year round. And we need to find ways to extend that supply of nitrogen, because the forage stand, if you apply nitrogen on an N-deficient bromegrass stand, it'll just quickly absorb that nitrogen from the soil, and it'll be quickly utilized in your first cut. What's some things that we can do to extend the availability? Well, there is tools like ESN and polymer-coated nitrogen. If you use that as part of your nitrogen supply for your grass forage stand, that'll help extend the availability of N later in the season. And now that might be later in the season for hay cuts, or it might be later in the season for better late season grazing as well. Just to extend that season of grazing to make the most of your forage stand.
Well, Lyle, some great forage insights. Always appreciate you making some time for Real Agriculture here at Ag in Motion.
Thank you very much for having me again.